I've been thinking about how there hasn't really been a revolutionary music movement in the past, 30 years, probably. Not since, I think the last genre that had quite an impact and changed the music scene quite a bit was the grunge movement, which I don't know what the first grunge band was, but that was what was Chris Cornell's band? The one he's most famous for. I'm thinking of Audio Slave, but it's not that one. It's the one before that. I forget. But every time there's a new musical movement, the first bands or artists of that movement, they don't identify with that name a lot of the time. It's usually a name that's given to them by music press or the people, the Sex Pistols. They didn't say we're a punk band. They didn't even really choose to adopt the name until many years later. Johnny Rotten was saying that he's the king of punk, which, who can really argue with that? Who else is the king of punk? I think the first genre in modern music, you could say, that really shook things up was jazz, because jazz came. I think early jazz wasn't that experimental. The big band jazz is kind of just typical music to dance to, but the kind of jazz that a lot of people think of when they hear the name jazz is that really arty, weirdo kind of type of jazz where it's it just seems like chaos kind of. And I think more experimental jazz isn't what jazz was originally, but it was one of those first disruptive genres in modern music. Disruptive as in it kind of tore up the rule book. I can't say that jazz was the first genre to tear up the rule book, because it depends what you mean by that, but I mean just it introduced a more impulsive kind of approach to playing where it's not so robotic. But contemporary classical came about around about the same time. Maybe it was, I think it was the late 1800s that contemporary classical came about. And again, how do you define that? But I'm talking about it was in the early 1900s that contemporary classical was getting really weird and experimental. So it actually, I think, had a big influence on jazz, and jazz might have had an influence on contemporary classical as well. But I'm not going to go through all the genres that have had a big impact on culture. Of course, rock and roll was quite a abrupt change in culture, because it brought in a whole new kind of beat built on a bit of jazz and blues and other genres that existed, but it was more fast-paced kind of dancey music. Then rock got kind of boring in a lot of people's eyes, so when punk came about, it was bringing the attitude of not caring about playing perfectly and being a bit messy, not intentionally really, but that's a part of it. It's more raw, I guess. I think the emergence of grunge music had a similar impact to the emergence of punk music, because it brought a kind of rawness to rock that hadn't really been there. Even though punk already existed, and it did kind of influence it did influence a few grunge bands, so it's not like they dismissed punk, but it just became a bit of a stale kind of format, and so grunge was like a new punk with a different look, and it was a bit more fun than the quite self-serious arena bands that were playing like hair metal and whatever other kind of rock was popular in the late 80s, early 90s. But those are just a few examples of genres that had a kind of movement. They were more than just a new sound. In the 2000s and 2010s, even in the 2020s, there's not really like so much of a signature sound or movement that really is easy to distinguish. There's types of music nowadays that are quite unique, but there's not really a movement that goes with it. What I'm trying to say is that there's a lot of exciting new music nowadays, like hyperpop and neurofunk or other kinds of heavy EDM, electronic kind of stuff. Not so much interesting rock music. I think people are running out of ways to innovate in the world of rock. I think Queens of the Stone Age and Radiohead were also Nine Inch Nails. There's some of these bands, I guess you can barely even call Radiohead rock for most of their career, but they're the ones that I find most interesting. A lot of rock is kind of a bit old and stale. I'm getting the shakes now. This is what happens when I've been doing this for too long. But while there are a lot of interesting new musical artists nowadays, they don't really have much of a cultural impact, or at least the genre that they're part of doesn't really have a cultural impact. There's a lot of interesting music, but what's it really doing for culture? That's what I'm asking.